We're just looking at the election advertisements currently peppering Moscow. Now, there are 26 parties on the ballot for this election, but only a few appear to stand a realistic chance. Now, here's a look at who they are and the issues they face.
There is change in the air in Moscow, legitimate change. Elections many feared would be canceled are going forward.
It's significant that Russia has reached these parliamentary elections without the dismissal of the government. Yeltsin was very uncomfortable with the previous parliament, but ultimately felt constrained to respect the election that took place in 1995.
We're in the midst of a normal election campaign, the third such election campaign the Russians have been engaged in the 1990s. And I think it's part of the process of democratization. It's an important part of that process.
The significance of these elections goes beyond the Duma seats being fought for.
Russians certainly tend to see this Duma election as a primary for the presidential election, which is coming up in June of next year.
And whatever parties dominate these elections have the upper hand in putting forth their presidential candidate, Yeltsin's successor, in June. Here is a look at the parties and key players. Communists, they have dominated parliament so far. This time around, they may end up with close to 20%. By the day of the elections, a party called Unity, backed by the Kremlin and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, may be neck and neck with the communists, helped by plenty of TV time on Kremlin-backed media. In third place, but losing ground rapidly in the polls, is the Fatherland All Russia Party, led by former Prime Minister Primakov and Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov. Another party, Yabloko, headed by reform-minded Grigory Yavlinsky, expected to gain less than 10%. Many think this new power balance will help create consensus for legislative reform, create coalitions to bypass any remaining hardline communist resistance.
There is no longer any serious communist threat in two ways. First of all, the communists will lose their majority, and secondly, the communists have turned slightly pro-market after having been in government.
The communists today are genuinely, at least as far as their rhetoric suggests, in favor of keeping privatization, of not proceeding with wholesale renationalization, and relying on free market, regulated free market with a considerable social cushion, but a free market nonetheless.
One key player for presidential elections next year is current Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, Yeltsin's choice of successor. Putin's hard line on Chechnya has won over many Russians. The multiple bombings in Moscow this year have been blamed on Chechen extremists. Many view Russian victory over Chechnya as an issue of national pride.
Putin, who is very popular currently in Russian public opinion, partly because he's been perceived as successful in waging this war in Chechnya. If he decides to run for president, and if his popularity holds, he will be able to beat any contender, including Primakov or Lushkov or the communists, assuming they run Zyuganov. Right now, Putin beats any candidate hands down.
But no political victory in Russia is ever assured. Well, joining me now to give their views on what these elections mean for the future of Russia are Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian studies at New York University, and Michael Barr, emerging markets analyst at HP Capital Markets Group. And gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me today. Stephen, let's start with you. This is almost the eve of a very important moment. We are getting quite a bit of shift. In fact, the Unity Party has come up so fast this week, we had to redo our graphic on their percentage gains. Right. What's your assessment of the elections at this point?
Well, my first assessment is that what Joseph Stalin said some 60 years ago still matters. It's not who votes, it's who counts the vote. I don't think we can believe these polls. They're approximate. They're cooking the polls. They have been for ages. There are some worries that they might even falsify the returns. But the core issue of this election is really quite dramatic. And I think it's not what some of my colleagues think it is.
And which
it's
is
whether or not the people in the Kremlin for the last 7 or 8 years are going to keep power in the Kremlin or are going to go to prison. That's the core issue. It's fear and loathing It's fear of being held responsible for what's happened in the country that's driving this election, and the war in Chechnya, which in turn now is driving the election itself.
All right. We're going to get to the war in a second. I want to get Michael's opinion on this. Now, Stephen suggests that the Kremlin power grip is the real issue here, and in fact, I don't think anyone would really argue with him at this. Unity is a Kremlin-backed party. We just mentioned it's gaining strength. What's your assessment of the Kremlin versus non-Kremlin forces that are splitting up?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons you've seen so many of the prime ministerial selections by Yeltsin coming out of the state security apparatus more or less supports that view. The fact that Putin, Stepashin, Primakov, the last three, have all had intimate ties with security indicate that they are concerned about the future. Certainly Yeltsin is concerned about the future for himself and his family and their business interests that they've developed in Russia. Okay, now Yeltsin's man, Vladimir Putin, he basically threw his support to the Unity Party just recently, actually very recently. And this is gaining strength. As Stephen suggests, Chechnya is actually helping him with public opinion. It's an issue of national pride. Does this mean the war will continue?
Well, let's begin by reminding ourselves that Unity didn't exist 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Right.
I mean, it's a fictitious creation. Even its membership is fictitious. It has no program. I see the war in Chechnya, and I only exaggerate this much, a tiny bit, not as a war for Chechnya, but as a war for the Kremlin. That is, it's a politically driven war. Otherwise, how to explain the desperate attempt to plant a Russian flag in the capital city of Grozny prior to the election on Sunday, which in turn led to the massacre 48 hours ago of 100 to 125 Russian soldiers. So it's being driven by politics, and the politics has been driven by, as Michael said, this fear of the Yeltsin family of losing power in the presidential election, which is only 6 months away.
We'll pick up the threads of that thought in just a minute. We'll take a quick break. And coming up, we'll look at Western investment interests in Russia, how government policies have affected some blue chip companies doing business there. Do stay with us.